So standing here on the edge of this hill, I have to bring in one of my favourite characters, Giovanni Battista Viotti. In 1792, he wrote a little essay about taking a walk in the French Alps. And it's one of the first great moments we have of a musician describing being in the countryside. And he described walking down paths he didn't know, and getting lost in a valley he didn't recognize. And he described a valley of incredible beauty with flowers and plants, and he described absolute perfect harmony. And so he abandoned himself to a reverie and sat down on a rock to gather his thoughts. And he described that his emotions stood completely still. He described his heart standing free from passion. But while he was sitting there, he heard the sounds coming from the other side of the valley. Exquisite music, he didn't know what it was. So he walked across the valley to try and find out where it was coming from. He said, after pulling himself together and shedding a few tears. So he walked across the valley, and he said the sounds came from a sort of long trumpet, and a woman's voice was blending with a long trumpet in exquisite unison. So he decided he would engrave the music, this is his words, engrave the music on his heart, commit it to memory, so he would never forget the combination of music and landscape. And he said to the reader, this is what I'm communicating to you. And then he talked to the question of being natural. He said that the way that the music worked in the landscape, going from hill to hill without any echo, was such that if he wrote it down with bar lines, with measure it would be in French, then it would be denatured, it would lose everything that made it special. And he said this is why he wrote it down without bar lines, without measure, and this is what I'm communicating to you here. And then he finishes the bit of writing by saying, I only play this in places with the best of my friends, and it behoves that the reader's imagination carry you and the music to the Alps where I first heard it. And he said, the best of my friends have heard it. And what he heard was a rance des vaches, a cow call, and I think it's just perfect to bring it to here. Music heard in the countryside, transcribed in the countryside, which only really makes sense outside. So this is Giovanni Battista Viotti writing in 1792.
In a place like this in Farnham Heath, you've got a classic example, really, because this is an artificial habitat, and I don't just mean because it's a 21st century nature reserve, but heathland itself, exists because there was a class of landowning people that decided to enclose the original heath in order to either plant trees or graze sheep and so-called improve the pasture land. And they weren't doing that for the good of humanity, they were doing that for their own profit. And that's what I think tended to get celebrated in, if you like, the high art of the time. And whilst at the same time you had people that were often excluded from landscapes that they'd occupied as commoners up until that point, so they were having to make a living in a different way. They were having to find new ways of engaging with the semi-natural environment, let's call it, that they inhabited. So it would be fascinating to go back and imagine how, for example, the words to folk songs might have changed in those days, and did that reflect the social changes that they were that were imposed on them, in the same way that the high art reflected the social changes of the imposers. The RSPB, which when it was first founded in 1889 was called the Fur and Feather Club, was actually founded by women, upper middle class ladies, who essentially objected to the fact that the fashion trade was killing huge numbers of birds, mainly for the millinery trade, in fact, for hats. And it all started off in Manchester, in Didsbury near Manchester, where they would, after church every Sunday, they would put notes through women's doors if the woman had worn a hat with a bird feather in it, like an egret plume, for example, and just remind them that a bird died for that hat. And there were similar movements happening around the country, and they eventually joined forces and became the Society for the Protection of Birds, and then the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds in 1904, when Edward VII granted a royal charter. And at that time it was mainly about the individual destruction of birds, for example for the plumage trade, and less about, in fact not at all about the need to protect environments like the one we're at today, Farnham Heath. But there was a time in perhaps the 1930s when it started to become clear that actually the most important places for birds do need to be protected as nature reserves. And so that eventually became a much more comprehensive ecological understanding of conservation as being about maintaining or restoring ecological balance, rather than simply being a focus on individual species.
Well, the RSPB had always been looking for a site where they could do some fairly extensive heathland restoration. But in terms of this particular patch, that's possibly my fault as well, because it's an area I'd known well since 1987, and I'd seen it come up onto the market. So I sent them a fax saying, well, there's this big block of conifer plantation. I know from historic records and the original 1816 Ordnance Survey map that it had historically been heathland. Would it be something that the RSPB would be interested in? And they said yes, and I met them up on site and I walked them round, and then lo and behold, yeah, they bought it, job came up, and they gave it to me.
So you supervised the felling of the trees?
Yeah, drew up the original environmental impact statement, drew up the contract for the felling, and basically oversaw it from a howling wasteland of nothing but commercial timber crop to something that actually supports some wildlife.
You know, if you go back to the Bronze Age, then this probably was more forested, and then there was a long period of time when what you might call ordinary people, who weren't privileged in any respect, occupied this land as commoners, with their grazing animals, with their cutting of turf perhaps, and their cutting of brash, panning the pigs, and then suddenly, and it was quite sudden, in around the 18th century, I suppose, the big landowners started to enclose the land. And that was seen as a victory over nature. It was seen as taming the wastes, enabling this, so-called wasteland to be much more productive for wool production or for forests later on. And art tends to celebrate those people and their achievements. And of course the people that were ousted from the land, that had to find other ways of living, they must have also had an artistic tradition of some kind. They would certainly have had folk song. And we may never hear the songs of that time or the artistic responses to those changes, or the artistic expression of that close relationship, which was far closer relationship than the big landowners ever had. So you can see the high art of the 18th century as reflecting, as you said, a certain privileged view of what nature was and how we'd tamed it. And that might actually be completely different to the vast majority of people that had a very different relationship.
Now, one of the things which a conversation I've had with Mike Coates here and with you is we're on what is technically a reserve run by the Royal Society for Protection of Birds. But I know something which is very important for the people running this, for the RSPB and for you, is to make sure that people see birds as being part of the environment and not simply the only thing they're coming to see. I just wonder how it is that we can encourage that, to misuse a word, holistic approach to environments. Do you find yourself having to encourage, I'd say, bird watchers to see something bigger than that?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And I mean, some bird watchers, you'll never get them to do anything but watch birds. But actually most bird watchers, in my experience, are fascinated by other forms of wildlife, at least. And I think the next step, which I do in workshops and things like that, is to get people to maybe use writing or some other response, sketches or whatever, to explore the sort of total landscape in a way that, focusing on this species and then that species and ticking them off on the list doesn't really enable you to do, doesn't really allow you to do.
So an example is wood pigeon going past us there, right? For instance, so my response to that wood pigeon is I'm really fascinated by the combination of the trajectory across the sky and the shape of its wing beats, where there's a counterpoint there. And if I think about the difference between a simple thing, the fact that martins and swifts tend to hunt at different heights. Yes, martin's going to be low, the swift is going up as high as it possibly can, as most of the time. And also the result of that is that if you think the trajectory, the curve of a swift is much grander, whereas a martin is doing small things often round your head. Or then swallows. I've had the experience in Cyprus of swimming and realising that a swallow was hunting at water's height, coming straight for my head, which is one of the scariest things. You realise it's coming at you at 30, 40 miles an hour. So that seems to be, I mean, look at them, they're doing it again. For me, as a musician, curiously, I think I get more from that kind of play of shape in the sky than I would from, as Edward Carey's pointed out, the fact that a wood pigeon, when it leaves the tree, it's one moment of undignified flight is this kind of clap it does as the wings get purchase on the air.
Yeah, I mean, Edward Carey is a really good example actually of what you were just describing, because there's a rhythm to that flight. There's a you could almost say there's a line to it which would so easily translate into a melodic line, for example, if you wanted to respond in that way. And what you were saying about martins and swifts, occupying different levels in the air. Well, sound does the same thing. Violin occupies one register, cello occupies a different register, and whether you choose to put those things together artificially as a composer, or whether you observe it happening naturally in the natural environment, as we've just been doing, they're both in many ways a response, aren't they? To just, I suppose, recognising patterns, or finding patterns, or looking for patterns that may not be there, but somehow you perceive them anyway. Isn't that something that you find when you're improvising, for example, that you can't improvise except in the context that's around you?
Well, here we are in a fairly obvious bit of heath, and from a distance one bit of heath looks very much like another bit of heath, and I say that even as someone who's worked on heath for 15 years, particularly over the winter. They can look a bit dull, but if you get down to the ground, there's differences. There's differences actually in the heather structure. We've got areas here where the heather is actually quite short, it's quite cropped. That's probably either cattle or rabbits. It may be cattle because we do have cattle on this site. We also have the mature stuff. Now that sounds boring, but it's really interesting, because different species of invertebrate and, on a larger scale, birds will use different heights of heather for different things. So woodlark is a species that I've talked about before. Woodlarks, the rule of thumb for them is if they can't see over the top of it, it's too tall. So they like areas with short heather, bare ground like this. They basically just wander around picking at it, picking up insects. Dartford warbler, they like the mature heath, they like the taller stuff. Nightjars also prefer the mature stuff. If you're going to have the full range of heathland species, you need to have short bits, tall bits, bits in between. But you also need these gaps between the heather bushes, because these gaps are absolutely fantastic for all sorts of things. Lichens in particular. Now, I am not a lichenologist, and anybody who watches this that is probably going to be screaming. But there are several different species of lichen just in here. You've got this little one here with the red tip. That's the devil's matchstick. I mean, what a fantastic name, the devil's matchstick. Cladonia fleurkiana. We've got various other things here. They're nearly, I think they're all cladonias. That's the point at which lichenologists would be screaming at me. But there's lots of different species in this tiny little patch, just in this little gap between heather bushes. Heathlands look boring until you get down and look at the detail. And when you get down and look at the detail, they are just full of beauty. I mean, if you just look at the shapes of this is winter time. It is a relatively boring time. Flowering plants aren't flowering, insects aren't about much. There is still an astonishing range of forms and structures, all found within this little bit of heath here.
Earlier in the day, Peter and I had a conversation about these trees, and it was a little bit windier earlier, and the trees were swaying a little bit in the wind, as they always do, and we noticed that they didn't sway in any kind of unison or harmony, but that the big thick trees would sway slowly, and the little thinner ones would have a different pulse to their movement. And when you look at 3 or 4 trees doing that, you can more or less follow what's going on. But then when it happens with hundreds of trees, all you really see is what I've called a counterpoint, a pine tree counterpoint, a really complex array of movements. And we thought about this in musical terms. We've been thinking a lot today about music in the landscape, and I couldn't help feeling that there was a kind of visual music in watching the swaying of these trees and finding, well, a resonance between that visual impact and the way, for example, a musical instrument works, or the way music itself works. And so I did what I often do in those circumstances. I started to scribble a few words, and these are literally just scribbled words, which may one day find their way into a poem or a piece of prose, or they may just stay in my notebook forever and never be used. And they're just really a collection of words, really, but they try to do justice to that concept of there being a kind of a great music happening in the landscape. Pine tree counterpoint. Time and meter measured on the dendro scale. Strings of an earth harp vibrating, resonating, G sharp. Resinating, rosinating. An octave leap to the next wind-plucked tree. The harmonics and the interference pitches as the trees vibrate, the strings vibrate, their differing frequencies according to their gauge. Their music is beyond hearing, rooted in the earth, the tonic.